Hello friends, my name is JJ, and last week we had a lot of fun talking about caricature. Caricature, of course, being the uniquely 20th century art of making hyper-stylized portraits of people capable of capturing their likenesses in creative and unconventional ways. And one of the interesting things about caricature that I didn't fully get into last time, but we will today, is the subgenre of caricature that entails reducing people to incredibly simple, abstract symbols, what is sometimes known as minimalist caricature. This is the idea that in the same way we can recognize a geometric abstraction like this to mean person sitting in a wheelchair representing the concept of disabled people, or this to mean detective's magnifying lens representing the concept of a computer's file search function. It is also possible to recognize this as meaning the 45th president of the United States of America. I was thinking about this because as part of my research on last week's video, I was reading through a lot of old back issues of Vanity Fair magazine from the 1920s and 30s, which is something I highly recommend doing, by the way. America in the Jazz Age was a fascinating place. Anyway, two back-to-back issues of Vanity Fair from 1935 featured a bunch of ultra-minimalistic drawings of celebrated faces of our time by the cartoonist Frank Dunn. Here, let me show you a couple. Anne Harding, Adolphe Menjou, George Arliss, President Coolidge, Vice President Dawes, Maurice Chevalier, and Al Smith. Now, chances are high none of these meant anything to you, but they would have seemed very clever to American magazine readers 86 years ago, in the same way that this Time magazine cover probably struck you as at least a little bit clever, even if it might not necessarily mean anything to someone in the year 2107. But that said, here are a couple others from Frank Dunn that might be a little bit easier to appreciate. Charlie Chaplin, Albert Einstein, and Adolf Hitler. What this hopefully shows is that the ability to make an effective minimalist caricature of someone is a product of both their appearance and their contemporary fame. Some of these guys are mostly forgotten today, so we have no real idea of how to read the abstract symbols that represent them, but we can still read some of the symbols of people who are still well known in the present. In other words, creating an abstract caricature is not a game you can play with anyone, but rather requires a unique mix of variables, which can probably teach us something important about the nature of celebrity and the art of image building. So there are basically two ways that a famous person can become so visually iconic that even the most untalented artist can draw them with just a few sketchy lines. The first is that the celebrity just puts a lot of conscious effort into looking visually distinctive. Basically, they want to be a caricature or a symbol. As I discussed in my previous video, this was much more of a thing that celebrities did in the old days, when looking artificial or constructed wasn't considered as taboo as it is now, when everyone is trying to seem very authentic and effortless and real.
It's real!
Picking a prop and making it your trademark thing was one way that you could construct an image. An actor like Maurice Chevalier or a politician like Al Smith might choose to always wear a certain kind of hat all the time, for instance, so that the hat became part of their brand, as we would say today. Or how about monocles? Monocles are almost completely useless as any sort of aid to help you see better, but famous people like the actor George Arliss, the director Erich von Stroheim, or the British politician Austen Chamberlain all wore monocles because they helped make them more recognizable as public figures. Back when smoking tobacco was still socially acceptable, having a smoking prop was a popular thing as well. Former Vice President Charles Dawes smoked this big, goofy-looking pipe, for instance. And well into the 1970s, a lot of politicians and authors and intellectual types would ostentatiously smoke pipes or cigars in public so that they could become known as the pipe or cigar guy. People would sometimes even insist on having them in their official portraits. Those long cigarette holder things were popular for a time as well, embraced by presidents and writers and movie stars who wanted to build a sort of sophisticated brand. I always liked how the journalist Hunter S. Thompson continued to use one long after they had fallen out of popular use. Hunter S. Thompson's writings were often illustrated by the cartoonist Ralph Steadman, who had a lot of fun doing minimalist caricatures of Thompson, consisting of little more than his glasses and the cigarette thing. But visual gimmicks of these sorts weren't just limited to props. Having a very distinctive hairstyle or type of facial hair could work as well. The actress Anne Harding tied her hair back in this distinctive way that was considered her big trademark in her heyday. And even men as different as Albert Einstein and Adolf Hitler purposefully did weird stuff with their hair in order to be memorable as well. In a more modern example, we could say Donald Trump was clearly someone who built a lot of his personal image around having purposefully weird hair. I will confess that my desire to be a famous TV pundit back in the day had a lot to do with the fact that I had a mustache and crazy hair for so many years. Well, I guess the hair is still pretty crazy. Do you think I should cut it short again? The point is, I knew that having a visual trademark would make me more memorable, although these days trying too hard to look distinctive can also come off as a little obnoxious or extra, which is why I don't have the mustache anymore. Which is actually an interesting topic in its own right. The phenomena of public figures in modern times abandoning their visual gimmicks in order to come off as more normal and authentic. I know that political pundit Tucker Carlson famously stopped wearing bow ties a while ago, which had previously been his big thing.
People hate you so much when you wear a bow tie that it's probably not worth the conflict.
Bruno Mars and Justin Bieber would similarly be examples of stars who changed their once super iconic hairstyles in an effort to prioritize being stylish over being distinctive. You can probably think of some other good examples. Now, the second path to having a visual image so distinctive that someone could draw it on an Etch-a-Sketch is something that you yourself have less control over as opposed to the caricaturists. If you're a person who people are going to be drawing all of the time, and the public is going to be looking at drawings of all of the time, it only makes sense for a visual shorthand of that person to get developed just for the sake of easier communication. I like this 1991 quote from the British cartoonist Gerald Scarfe, who drew political cartoons for 50 straight years, explaining how his technique worked. If you are drawing for a newspaper, you can eventually convince the public that the George Bush you drew in January is the same George Bush you drew completely abstract by November. George Bush, the older one, is actually a good example of this phenomenon because he was a man with a rather boring face who didn't put much effort into trying to look distinct or memorable. Unlike, say, Ronald Reagan, who as a Hollywood actor from the golden age clearly knew the benefit of having a very distinctive visual style. Unlike Reagan, however, George H.W. Bush was a man who spent much of his career in non-public facing jobs like ambassador or head of the CIA, where we can assume personal brand matters a bit less. But he still wound up as president anyway, which posed a challenge for cartoonists who were used to drawing more flamboyant politicians. So what happened is what usually happens in these sorts of cases. The caricatures of Bush just gradually got more stylized and abstract until the cartoonists of America had established a kind of George Bush symbol that everyone had been conditioned to accept. It was a symbol that looked something like this, with a thin head, pointy nose, and big glasses. This was eventually what you would come to see in all of the newspaper cartoons and other stylized depictions of him in the media. If you had shown people this picture of Bush when he was in an earlier phase of his political career, I'm not sure that many people would recognize it as him. Bush didn't wear particularly large glasses, and he didn't even wear them full time. In fact, he quite explicitly did not like wearing his glasses in public because he thought they made him look old and weak, but they became his symbol anyway because they were helpful in filling a symbolism vacuum. Another good example would be Calvin Coolidge. Today, we think of Coolidge as being a mostly forgettable president with a mostly forgettable face. But if you were living in the 1920s, he would have been a guy you'd be seeing a lot in political cartoons and magazine caricatures and protest signs and whatnot. And it seems that over time, cartoonists of that age just established this visual shorthand of him as this little egg-headed man with a pointy nose. We could probably think of some more modern examples of this as well. For example, if I drew this, who would you think it was supposed to be? Kanye, right? I don't think Kanye actually ever wore this type of glasses all that much, and he certainly doesn't these days, but because he's one of the major celebrities of our time, our culture needed some sort of easy visual shorthand for him, and this seems to be what people settled on. Now, as I said, minimalist caricatures only really work so long as the person they depict is broadly well known. Most of those Vanity Fair caricatures are unrecognizable to Americans today because they're so old, but the same phenomenon can just as easily happen when you come across a minimalist caricature from a country or culture you're not familiar with. For example, this is a very iconic poster from French history. used during a famous 1968 student protest against the government. And do you know who this guy is? It is the old president of France, Charles de Gaulle. This is actually a sort of fun example of both sorts of celebrity iconography mixing. On the one hand, the first clue it's de Gaulle is this little cylindrical French army hat, which he wore all the time as part of his effort to construct an image of himself as this heroic military man. And then meanwhile, we also have this giant nose, which reflects how French cartoons of de Gaulle during his long career gradually emphasized his nose more and more, until eventually you could just draw a big nose with an army hat and every French person would know it was the president. This protest poster here is even more abstract. I don't even think most people would know that this is supposed to be a person, unless you were deeply familiar with French iconography of the late 1960s. But then again, I'm sure that a lot of French people could look at this drawing of the same period and have no clue it was supposed to be Richard Nixon. During the 1970s, there was a famous political cartoonist in Pakistan who went by the name Vi L and basically only drew in these very crude, minimalistic caricatures. This was how he drew their prime minister of the time, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Just a scribble representing his big lips and double chin, and then another scribble representing his sideburns. And when Bhutto was overthrown by this guy, General Zia, this is how he drew the new president. Just a little circle with big bug eyes and a big mustache. Another good example of combining something that the person himself curated with something that the public just fixated on. And since you asked, of course I can draw you some minimalistic caricatures of people from recent Canadian history. Hopefully, if you are a Canadian like me, you can recognize these two. Here is the answer. This probably means nothing to you if you're not Canadian, and even if I show you photos of these two men, it will probably still seem unimpressive, just because, again, you haven't had any reason to become literate in Canadian caricature code. Now, you might think that this internet age of ours has been a golden era for minimalist caricatures, what with all of the memes and whatnot, but it doesn't seem like that's been the case at all in reality. For whatever reason, meme culture seems more obsessed with satirizing and stereotyping kinds of people rather than specific celebrities. And if memes ever do feature real people, they usually just use photos rather than drawings, which is personally part of the reason why I do not find memes all that fun, because I just don't think there's that much artistry to them. But that's just me. All right, so I got a couple of discussion questions for you all. The first is for those of you who come from exotic foreign lands. Can you think of some public figures in your country, past or present, who could be reduced to a minimalistic caricature of just a few lines or shapes that everyone in your community would recognize? And second is a question for everyone. Can you think of some internet celebrities, like YouTubers or other social media stars, who you think have become a very iconic visual symbol, either through deliberate effort on their part, or because satirists have just turned them into one? Because I think it could be fun for a future video to see how many internet people I could draw minimalistic caricatures of. But I need your help first.